very center of this public health crisis was Paul Nannis, then City of Milwaukee Health Commissioner. In 2015, Paul was quoted as saying, "It was definitely the most intense 3 weeks of my life." I hope that's still true. Paul had been the commissioner for 5 years in 1993, joining the department in 1988, and a position that he held until 1998. He joined in 1988, departed in 1998. Prior to coming to the City Health Department, Paul worked at the 16th Street Community Health Center, where he was the executive director. He worked at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation as a senior program officer, and where he began development of planned national programs of public health, urban health, and vulnerable populations. Following his time at the City of Milwaukee, he became the director in the Office of Planning at the Department of Health and Human Services. He worked at the Center for Urban Population Health as the interim director, and Aurora Healthcare as a vice president of government and community relations. Currently, Paul is the CEO of Strategic Healthcare Solutions, a firm that he opened in 2008. If you're at all interested in the subject or reliving those days, I think many of you don't want to relive those days, but to learning about what happened, we have the right man with us today. Please join me in welcoming Paul Nannis.
Milwaukee water. You know, every time I hear somebody read my resume, I feel like I'm getting older and older. It's like, and I guess I am. Well, this is an interesting story, and I'm glad to talk about it. I've talked about it a lot, as a number of folks in here have as well, over many, many years. And we learned more about it over many, many years. When I was asked by Dan to put this together, and I thank Paula for the introduction and Dan for all of his work, it was like, which way do I go with this? There's so much science, we could focus on science. There's so much with water and water technology, we can go with that. There's so much around the illness and the personal impact of this, we could go with that. So what I've tried to do is really put together a presentation that talks about what happened, what we did, and what we learned, and just in that kind of a summary fashion, speak about something that we could speak about for many, many years. I mean, I could speak about it for many years. See if I can do this right. All right, so I want to just start with a little overview of Cryptosporidium. I know when I turn my head and talk to the slides, you can't hear me, so go like this and I'll know. The organism that we're focusing on was first described in 1907. It wasn't reported until 1950s, and that was in turkeys. But in the 70s, it seemed to be generating more interest around calves and cattle, which is why, in some way, we first started with thinking that this was a cattle or calf problem, which we'll talk more about. The first human exposure was 1976. We then had 6 cases, bloomed to 47 cases. It wasn't until 1985 that it actually was described in the manual. And by 1988, there were 500 cases and 1,500 articles. I'll tell you, if you Google Cryptosporidium today, you'll have 5,000 pages of articles and stories. There's just been so much written about this, which I guess is good because we've learned from it. Let me just start by saying we know that this was the world's largest, or at least the United States' largest waterborne outbreak. We started knowing about this in March. We lived it out in April, and we've been living it out ever since. As I mentioned, the first case wasn't really known until 1976. And it really didn't evolve until there was a small outbreak in Georgia, and then we had our outbreak here. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so here's the life cycle, what we call the oocyst. More importantly is the piece up front here, which is just the cycle of how we get infected, how it's carried through the host. I won't belabor this too much. The oocyst itself completes its life cycle in the GI tract. The incubation is 2 to 10 days, and that's important. I'll come back to this incubation period in a minute. The most significant sign of this is watery diarrhea, although complications can be respiratory, gallbladder, pancreatic. The primary presenting problem here was diarrhea. Okay, just a little bit more in crypto. We talk about whether it was secret or whether it was hidden. Crypto actually means and has come to be known as the hidden seed. It was hidden from us. It's been around, of course, forever, but it wasn't until that last sequence of events that it was uncovered. It can remain dormant for long periods of time. It's resistant to most disinfectants. If I have my data straight, there was a time when we thought about, can't we just add more chlorine to the water to kill it? And it turns out you'd have to add enough chlorine to the water to kill us, to also kill the Cryptosporidium. So that didn't really work. It's a small organism, and the infectious dose is believed to be about 10 of the organisms. Ingesting 10 of them is enough to make you sick. The other thing is, well, we learned about it from the small outbreak in Georgia, and then we had our outbreak here. Many believe that there have been other outbreaks, and we just don't know about it. We get GI illness all the time in the winter and during different periods of time, and one has to wonder in retrospect, could it be cryptosporidiosis? And we don't really know in a lot of cases. As I've said, and as Paul has said, this is the largest waterborne outbreak in the United States. Since we've been keeping records, some believe the largest in the world, although the records are a little scant. We had laboratory, one of the things the Milwaukee Health Department had that was smart, and it was done before this, was create relationships with hospital labs. So we had lab reports coming to us, but they failed to detect this particular parasite because people weren't looking for it, they weren't thinking about it. So even though we had some passive surveillance going on, it really didn't become apparent that something more significant was happening until we realized that we were getting calls from citizens, we were getting calls from media, we were seeing schools close, and then of course, as was mentioned, the lack of over-the-counter antidiarrheal meds. You know, one of the stories I tell is that sometimes when I found that when I was health commissioner, people think you know more than you know, which is a lot, I guess. So people would come up to me and say, hey, my neighbor's sick or my kid's sick, is there something going around? And it's like, you know, you take it with a grain of salt and say, well, maybe we'll look into it and we'll see if it's going to, you know, try to put people at ease. But over that first weekend, and I'm going to come to the timeline, I noticed, I know Kathy noticed, Liz Zelazek, who's our director of nurses, noticed that a lot of people were saying, what's going on? Well, there seems to be a lot of people sick. And as it turns out, as I move into the timeline, of events, you know, that Sunday, we kind of thought about individually, because we weren't really working, but we were talking to people, is there something in the environment? Is there something going on? Something we should be thinking about? We knew we had a wet and rainy spring. We know that there are lots of runoff across the state into tributaries, into rivers, into the lake. So there's, you know, maybe something going on with the air or water or food or some connector. We began, as I said, to talk to people and realized a lot of people were getting sick. But when we came in Monday morning, we got together early Monday morning, because a number of us had had that experience over the weekend, and connecting the dots, which is what public health does best, help connect the dots. And we realized there's sickness here, there's vacancies here. I noticed that a number of our staff were gone. So we started making some calls, and we realized a lot of kids were out of school. And then we talked to other businesses, and we have our own networks, and they said, yeah, a lot of people are missing. So obviously a trigger to what was going on. We got together, we tried to figure out what we know, what we don't know. We knew it had to be something that could be dispersed at a kind of a magnitude of the level of a city. And so when you think about it, the only things that could possibly cause infection across multiple pools or populations is food, air, or water. Even though we were short-staffed because there were so many people sick, we had great, smart staff. And one of them was a world-class virologist in our lab, Dr. Sedmak, and he started making calls to his colleagues around to see if there's any kind of other incidents of illness that they're seeing in their labs. And what we began to find is there's a lot of people infected with very significant with diarrhea. Dr. Gradis, who was our lab director, also had his list of contacts, just as Kathy had hers and Liz I had mine, and we began to understand, okay, something's going on, that's a big deal. We called St. Luke's Hospital first, and they said, they're seeing people walking in with really bad diarrhea. We thought, it's puzzling. Called a second hospital, and we had the same story, with a lot of people walking in with very severe, gut-wrenching diarrhea. So we began to think through food, air, or water. Okay, so there could be distributors that deliver, and I'm only using this as an example, deliver lettuce to a McDonald's here, and a Wendy's here, and a Burger King here, and another restaurant there. But the magnitude of this seemed so large. One food vendor with one bad source of lettuce or peas or something just didn't make sense to us. What did make sense to us was air, because air would disperse the virus and we would figure out what's going on in the air. As we began to better understand the data that we were seeing, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, we were able to see clusters on the south side of town, significant clusters on the south side, but not much going on the north side, which puzzled us because if it were air, it would be relatively dispersed. But we realized we have two water plants. One serves the north side and one serves the south side. Maybe we ought to dig in to the issue of water, particularly water that's delivered on the south side. It was about this time on a Monday we began to call for help. People that know me know I'm not shy about asking for help. We called the state Division of Health. At later points we brought other people in, but the state started to get involved in this on Monday. We wanted to get information from the water department about the water testing that they do. The water department does its own testing, and they don't tell the health department routinely what that testing is unless there's something beyond the limits, the standards. And nothing had emerged beyond the standards, so there was no cross-communication between the water department and the health department. But we asked them to see their records anyways. And I know that there's been a lot written and a lot talked about the tension between the water department and the health department, and you can't accuse the water of being bad, and we're water and you're health. I actually see it a little differently. We talked to people who were very proud of the fact that they've been making and distributing clean water for 150 years. You know, we're a city that consumes a lot of water, we use it in our products, and so they were proud of their water, and in comes the health department saying, well, maybe we have a problem with the water. So we had to kind of sort through that a little bit. But when we did, and when we sat down together and began to look at their logs of things that are markers of water quality, we noticed there was a blip at a period of time. And while that blip never exceeded the standards set for what we call turbidity, the cleanliness in water, it was of interest from a public health eye that you had consistency in a blip and then back down to more consistency. To the water folks, they were doing their job, and they were. To the public health folks, it was something that gave us a clue to think we were on the right track, that the only thing that could have been dispersed to the south side, not uniform, not random, was water. Okay, by Tuesday, we now are in the news. I'm going to talk about the news a little bit more later. In fact, we're in the front page news. We knew now many schools were closed, many businesses were being affected. Of course, not everybody who lives, there are people that live on the south side that work downtown. There are people that work downtown that live on the south side. So it wasn't an absolute split between the two plants. There's obviously infection that crosses boundaries, but particularly the schools and the businesses on the south side were absent. We're getting more and more information. We're collecting more information from labs. We fortunately had good relationships with hospitals, and they were sending us information. And we were getting information from people that were calling. And I assume, although I haven't been at the health department much lately, although I was for a little while, that when people are sick, they call. They want to know what's going on. And we, of course, we have clinicians that call as well. So we were actively trying to sort and figure out what was going on. That was Tuesday. And by Wednesday, we were in a major surveillance position within the health department. We knew we had big problems, and we knew we needed to figure out what. We began to break into teams. We began to look at as many stool samples as we can. We actually paid people to go out and drive to emergency rooms to pick up samples and bring them to us. One of the things that happened, though, that day is that an infectious disease physician from St. Joe's, who happened to know about the outbreak in Georgia, began to think, well, let me just look in the stool specimen and see if I see any of the Cryptosporidium in the stool specimen. You usually don't. We average 4 or 5 cases of cryptosporidiosis a year. So it would be unusual if you found one, and he did, he found one. And then his lab tech found another and found another, and he called Dr. Gradis at the health department, our lab director, and Steve and Jerry Sedmak began to think, well, let's look at the stool samples we have. So we had 4 and they had 4, and at that point in time, we knew with certainty, this was far too much of a coincidence. We knew we had Cryptosporidium. We knew what was causing the illness. We knew what the agent was. Now, we didn't know where it came from. We didn't know how much of it was there. We knew it had to be a lot, but we at least had detected. And I'm proud of this because of the work that we did. And again, that's the big we. A lot of us did a lot of work. But from the time people were calling in sick and we began work on Monday, by Wednesday, we had identified this problem. At least it gave us a direction to go in. With certainty, we had identified the vehicle, the vector, the water, and that's really good public health work. It's a bad thing, but it's a good public health work. So we now knew we had a problem. If you go back to one of the earlier slides, and I talked about the duration from the inception or ingestion to symptoms, we talk in general with GI illness, 5 days, 7 days, maybe a little longer, maybe a little shorter. And we were looking at the lab turbidity reports now real time from Wednesday, and they were kind of back to normal. So we had our thinking, and We now had the state epidemiologist in there. We had CDC was called, EPA was called. And our science thinking was that this was an event that moved past the water plant and was now gone. Now, the way crypto tends to work is it forms a mass. It's not like evenly dispersed in a pool of water. It stays in this kind of, there's a word for it, I'm not remembering it, a kind of a set mass that moves itself. And it was clear from the turbidity reports, it moved past the water plant at this point in time, and now it was likely to be done. But we had the responsibility to balance what we thought was good science with what we know is good public health. And we met with the mayor in my conference room on Wednesday night. Kathy, you were there, and a number of other people were there. And while we argued science, this event has moved past us, the water looks good, we really should move on. The mayor, to his credit, said, can you assure that there's still no lingering cryptosporidium in the water? Are we clear that I can go before the public and say that this is done? We all hesitated a little bit. We kind of wanted to say yes, and the water department folks were saying, yes, the water's good. The mayor handed a glass of water to the state epidemiologist, Jeff Davis. Jeff recently passed away, but he was a great epidemiologist. I mean, he's been involved in every issue outbreak in the state for 40 years. The state owes him a lot. We owe him a lot. And when John Norquist handed Jeff the glass of water, he happened to be noticing that Jeff was drinking a Coke. And he said, Jeff, here's a glass of water. Will you have this water? And Jeff kind of backed away and said, no, I don't think I will. And the mayor said, that's the answer. Right then and there, the Boyle advisory was called. We had a press conference, and
Yay!
hey, the right order, what do you know? And that was the story. A Boyle order is a big deal, a very big deal. And people were scared by it, and we knew we need to frame this in a way that didn't create panic, but created enough concern that people did, in fact, boil their water if they were at risk. There's a whole other sidebar story to the bottled water, and at the time, was bottled water any better than regular water? We couldn't prove it, we didn't know it. There were not standards at that time, so we weren't clear that we could just say drink bottled water. Many people did. But boiling water, we knew would get rid of the parasite. So that's what we did. And the story goes on and on. I remember on that Thursday, we were thinking about what do we need to do and how do we do it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the teams that we put together to try to address this. But I remember vividly saying we need stool specimens. We need as many as we can get. And I remember meeting a new staff person. As health commissioner, I kind of like to introduce myself and meet new people and just say hello to them and welcome to the health department. And as she was coming to my office for the first time on her first day, the overhead PA announcer, the city hall announcer, said, the health department would like anybody who's willing to bring a stool specimen to the health department to please come over to the health department right now and we'll give you a kit. And she came into my office and said, is this the way it usually works for a first day? Like, it's just, there's a million stories to this, and no, that's not the way it usually works. But believe it or not, people did it. And of course, the more samples and the more information we had, the more we could talk about how deep and rich this outbreak was. There's a million pieces to who got affected, Now we had all the folks in from out of town. We have 77 businesses in Milwaukee that use water, unpasteurized water. And we needed to identify each one of them. We needed to send somebody out to each one of them. We needed them to destroy their stock. Most people were understanding of it. It cost some people a lot of money. We had businesses write to the mayor and write to the city attorney that it cost them this much money or this much money. I remember we ended up forcing a dairy company to dump 250,000 pounds of cottage cheese one day. There was just a lot of impact to this. But there were other things when you think about who uses water that we needed to identify and get to. Soda guns at restaurants. Dentists who are doing procedures use water. They had to all be shut down. We had to stop surgical procedures that were scheduled in hospitals because the water they were using for, or plan to use for the procedures was old water, and we had to stop. I mean, I want to, at the end, I'll come back and talk a minute or two about why I think people cooperated with us. We had trust and respect for one another, so they did this. I will say there were a few that weren't happy about us asking them to shut down. We had, my favorite story is, I won't tell who it is, but my favorite Mexican restaurant on the south side who assured me their hot sauce would kill anything, and they're not throwing out their food, and we kind of made them throw out their food, and it's a terrible story. But we knew now, the mayor was clear, and we were clear, that until we could prove clarity in the water, we had to close the Howard Avenue plant. It was hard, it was harmful to the people who had been working there for a long, long time, but they now knew we had to clean the water treatment plant and kind of improve on what was going on. The science of water technology and water treatment has evolved significantly in the last 25 years, but we really tore that place apart, redid the beds, added more monitors, eventually installed a new agent called ozonation, ozone that kills Cryptosporidium. But we knew we had to do it. We knew we had to start with closing the plant. What we didn't know is, when will we know that the water's clean? So if you go back to one of the slides earlier, 10 oocysts will contaminate a bottle, a glass of water, make you sick. When we were looking at the lake, and we were doing water samples, we're now in the lake pulling water samples, which is a very hard thing to do because you take large quantities of water, try to distill it down to an amount that can be analyzed by a lab. There are only 3 labs in the country that have the capacity to analyze water. You could do stool samples, but we had to send it to Illinois. And we had a good friend who knew water and Cryptosporidium and water, Dr. Joan Rose, and her lab helped us expedite the process, but it still had to be pulled, filtered, get down there and back. But then the question is, what if there's 1 oocyst? Does that mean it's good enough? Or what if there's 4? Or what if there's 6? What do we do? We decided that if there are any, we're not calling it clear. And we also decided we're going to keep the boil advisory on, which was very hard for people, particularly people with small kids. And I'll get to the immune compromised folks in a minute. Until we had 2 clean samples, we were going to keep the plant closed and keep the boil advisory on. But the science at the time wasn't the science that we have today. So we really were erring on the side of public health to say, until we have 0, we're clean. I want to go back for a minute to the issue of folks with immune-compromised systems. This is another one of those stories that could go on this tangent because it was such a horrible impact to people. As you know, and as many of you know, and I'll get to in a slide, we had over 100 people die during this outbreak, and most of those were people with compromised immune systems. We had a couple whose cause of death wasn't determined definitively. It was just systems failure, or was it the crypto, or probably both. But almost all of those patients that died were people living in the community with HIV or AIDS. So while we were doing this piece of work, the AIDS community was just dying. And it was just such a horrible time for us to see people in the streets while we were crying. They were crying because the people that they loved were dying, and we couldn't tell them what's going on. We couldn't answer, when will it stop? And so 5 died, and 12 died, and 30 died, and 90 died, and they had marches down the street and carried a coffin to City Hall. We understood this, we got it, we knew that they were hurting, we were hurting. Our issue was, when can we tell them that the water's safe? And we decided we're not going to compromise anybody, even if it's difficult. We're going to set that threshold at 0. While we were dealing with the external piece, and again, I'll come back to media, all of this was media, the AIDS piece, the people dying, the water plant, the boil advisory. We were working, and we were working hard. Some of the folks in this room and others, we put together about 10 or so teams to look at different pieces. For the sake of time, I'll go through these quickly. But there were so many components to this. We put together a team to look at the environment. Can we tell sources by flow of water? Can we look at how streams and canals connect to the lake? We did a nursing home study, which, again, all of these we could talk about in more detail, but I think this was Kathy Blair's idea, that people in nursing homes don't move. They stay in nursing homes. So we're looking at a population that worked downtown, lives in the south side, lived on the north side, but nursing home folks stay in their beds. We were able to tell people in nursing homes on the north side were pretty good. They were okay. But people in nursing homes on the south side were really sick. Again, it helps validate the assumptions that we made about the water plant on the south side. We looked at school absentee rates. We did a number, really CDC did a number of random digit dialing surveys. The digit dialing surveys was really to estimate the magnitude of the outbreak, because we were getting reportable cases, and I'll show you in a minute. While we were getting relatively small numbers of cases, large numbers of people were getting sick. And so we wanted to be able to measure the magnitude of the illness. And one way CDC does it, which is scientifically, statistically structured and done well, is through these random surveys. They did 4 of them. We did emergency room follow-up so that we could keep up with what's going on in the hospitals. We did a water filter study. We asked people to unscrew the screens on on your kitchen sink. So we asked people to take the screens out, thinking we might be able to capture what does it look like, what's the magnitude through the filter. It didn't exactly work out it was a great idea, and we did it. We didn't get the information we had hoped because of the time delay, and the oocysts were gone or had decomposed, but it was one of the things we thought was a smart thing to do, and it was. Obviously, the lab was burning the candle at both ends. We were doing lab-confirmed cases. If a case came into the lab, nurses went out and did follow-up, did classical epi and surveillance. Who have you been in touch with? Who have you been in touch with? How do we know where this chain ends? And of course, we had a public relations team. I'm going to come back to the PR piece. I think I'll hold that till later because there's so much to the media and the public relations. But we were organized. We had the teams work, and then we met twice a day so that we could collect the information, and then we met with the media. So what we knew, they knew. I'll come back to that because the media was really important to us. The one other thing that I want to mention that I thought was very creative and clever, and again, this is probably Kathy's idea, but we thought, okay, this mass of Cryptosporidium had passed the crib, what we call the crib, the intake pipe. Now, 10 days ago, 12 days ago, where would we find water that might give us a clue to how dense or thick the Cryptosporidium was in the water? And Kathy said, or Kathy and Paul B said, maybe the ice companies, maybe they made ice during that period of time and they froze the ice to distribute it. So we went to the ice maker, I forget the name of it, out on the west side, and they said, yeah, we have ice that was made during that period of time. And we were able to melt that down, and that was the only time we were able to see the real oocysts. Of course, they were frozen and dead, but we could see them. We could see the density of them. We could see the density within the ice. And we could actually go back in a point of time and see what was going on. It was really smart thinking. It was helpful. Again, all of these pieces have been written about and expanded on and studied, so you get in the Cliff Notes version of it. But it was really a smart thing to do and a very good thing to do. So I said to you, this activity was going on. We were working all weekend. We had really hundreds of people working. God bless our public health nurses and the environmental health staff.
Was that Easter Sunday?
Pardon? Yes, that was Easter Sunday. This was Easter Sunday. But we were working, we just had to keep going through this, and people were dedicated and supportive. The people from out of town worked, our staff worked. But when you look at the cases confirmed, we see, this is a lot of cases by itself, but when the CDC did their random digit dialing surveys, and they extrapolated to the magnitude of this outbreak, which is the number that we use, they use, CDC uses. We've argued a little bit over time. Maybe it's a little high, maybe it's not. It doesn't matter anymore. But what we found is 403,000 people were sick. That's a lot of people in the city of Milwaukee. We had 4,000 people hospitalized. And as I mentioned before, we had over 100 people die, most of them with compromised immune systems. Okay, let me kind of move forward here. I want to talk about lessons learned and then consequences, and then I'll end up so we can have a little bit of time with questions and answers. Lessons learned, the ongoing relationships within government really matter, because while this was happening to the health department, every department wanted to know what was going on. People were asking everybody, so we had to have a way to communicate internally. Obviously, we had to work with DPW, with the waterworks, but also with the mayor's office, the council. I mean, everybody was escalated about this. So ongoing internal relationships were important. Just as important were partnerships. Again, my background is 16th Street Community Health Center. I understand working with those communities. We had good relationships with the other community health centers, with people in the community. So we had a level of trust, and we went to them and asked them, tell us what you're hearing. We'll tell you what we're hearing. The partnerships that we had and the ones that we developed, we had partnerships with labs, we had partnerships with health providers, we had partnerships with health centers, we had partnerships with the schools. All of that, now managing all of that information was a challenge, because what were we working with in 1993? Phones and faxes. I think we may have had a basic rudimentary email system, but that's all it was. We didn't have analytics, we didn't have Google, we didn't have any of that stuff. We had volumes of information that we were sorting through, which was good because we need it, but very hard to sort through. We had great communication and relationships with the medical community. We wanted every doctor and every dentist and every clinician in town to know what was going on. We didn't have the capabilities of doing that. So we really relied on the medical societies, the dental societies, and others, the Cream City Medical Society, to get that word out to folks so that they knew what was going on. And we provided the information, but we couldn't get to everybody. They did, and that was really important to us. I mentioned the information stuff. It was just such an overload given how crude and rudimentary you think about systems were 25 years ago, and how to digest this and organize it and prioritize it. But we did. Leadership was really key. And I'll tell you just a quick story. When we knew we had a water issue, a boil advisory, people sick and dying, we met with the mayor, the same team that I'd talked about before, and there was a discussion by the mayor's communications staff with us about who's going to manage the message. Who's going to talk about this? You don't want everybody running off and telling their own story. There's got to be a kind of somebody with a message. Well, the water department wanted to manage it because it was a water issue, and I understand that. But the water was such an issue, we didn't think that that made a lot of sense. The mayor's staff said, well, the mayor has to manage it. You know, he's the mayor. He's got to stand on this. He's ultimately responsible. But we said, you know, John, we don't want to make this a mayor or political issue. It's a public health issue. And John stepped back and said, you're right. John Norquist. He said, you manage it. So I was the media point person on this with lots of support behind me. But it was such a smart thing to do. The focus was always on public health. It was never political. It was public health. And then the media, I could talk about the media so much. They were so important to us. I mean, I know some people fear the media and they think they only want to write bad stories. The media helped us get the message out so much. They did a 4-page special on what water's about, what's going on, what's the advisory for, what's happening. They distributed thousands of copies free of charge to the community, to the public. They were there. A couple of lessons I learned, which is, by now, this was a national story. This was an international story, really. We had the national guys in, the NBC guys, the ABC folks were in, and they wanted to bully their way in. They wanted to be the front of the line because they're the national folks. I always responded to the local media first. I never pushed them out of the way. I always went out of my way to make sure that the folks, the national folks, I get it. There's a big story. They're going to come and they're going to go. The folks that we need to have an ongoing relationship with the local folks, I said to them, and this is one of the hardest things I ever said, is I will tell you what I know, but I won't make stuff up. And there were a million unanswered questions. How long will it last? How do we fix it? When do we open the water treatment plant? I said, I just can't tell you. I won't tell you something I don't know. And it served us so well because we never had a story of, we said this and they did this. When we knew something, they knew something, and they respected it, and I respected their help. And the media was really, really critical to us. And it allowed me going forward. I mean, this didn't end in April of 1993. We're talking about it now. I mean, the media interest in this has been significant and ongoing for years. But they believed us, they trusted us, and we've never betrayed that trust, at least in our group. Okay, real quick. So there are good things that came out of a bad situation. One, of course, was the scientific understanding of Cryptosporidium, how it moves through the system, its interaction with the GI tract. We originally had thought it was a parasite carried mostly in calves, which, of course, the dairy industry went crazy about when we suggested it. Couldn't prove it. We just were raising theories. We learned subsequently, no, there's a number of hosts that the oocysts can have, Cryptosporidium can have, including humans, which we didn't know at the time. Of course, it was a huge opportunity for teaching and research. I have friends whose kids now are going to public health school, going to your school, Dean, and say, hey, we're reading about this in our textbook. Can you come and talk to me about it? I mean, it has evolved and changed, and there's been so much research and study. Of course, the issue of what it means for compromised immune folks was huge. And it's my guess that anyone with a compromised immune system here and anywhere doesn't drink municipal water. I happened to be close to the woman who was the health commissioner in New York City, Peggy Hamburg, and they have a open surface water. Now, our concern was our lake's what they call surface water, open water. New York has a series of water aqueducts that are open that flow north into the city. So extrapolate 100 deaths in Milwaukee to the population of compromised immune patients and persons in New York City. They were scared to death. And so, I mean, the dialogue among and between the health departments and the health communities was really important. New York was really smart. They were able to get in, measure, get in front of it, and they never had the kind of outbreak that we did. The national drinking water standards were changed. Obviously, there was a lot of technology improvement to the water treatment plants, from cleaning the beds to adding more monitoring to looking at the lab. And one of the things that came about it is a joint workforce between the health department and the water department. At one point in time, the water department actually reported to the health department, turn of the century. It turned out, well, water did water and we did sanitation at that time. So they didn't make the connection, they went their own ways. Because of this, water and health departments all across the country talk to each other. They share their lab results. They look at the turbidity reports. And I know this is still happening. In fact, the Clean Water Advisory Council that was created 25 years ago meets later this month. It's still going on. And of course, ultimately, we had new disinfectant systems put in the water treatment plants called ozone. We knew that in Europe, some of the water plants had used this agent called ozonation. It was a disinfectant that would kill Cryptosporidium but wouldn't kill you. And so we had to make that investment. This was another, I give John and the council a lot of credit for this, John Norquist. You know, most of the science was, it's passed, it's done, we're good, we're not getting any more reported diseases, we think we see an end to this. But politically, and really in the context of what people wanted, political in the sense of what people wanted, if we knew of a technology that could keep this from ever happening again, we needed to do it. So we spent almost $90 million in Milwaukee to upgrade the two water plants, which was exactly the right thing to do. I'm going to leave with just my comment that I've made. It's a little trite now, I guess, but you know, it's not a good thing that this happened in Milwaukee. This is really bad for people in Milwaukee and people that we've talked about. But in the context of advancing science, understanding waterborne illness, water treatment plants, cryptosporidiosis, we made our contribution. In some strange way, it felt good, and I have a hard time saying that because so many people suffered through this. So it was a terrible time. It was a terrible thing. But we did good things about it, and we've learned a lot from it. And then the last thing I'll say is, it's easy for me to talk about this, but there are many, many people that contributed to this. Kathy Blair, Kathy Miller, who worked with me diligently, Jerry Sedmak, the virologist, Steve Gradis, our lab folks, the folks in environmental health, all the public health nurses, Jeff Davis, God bless him, he was just wonderful to be with and wonderful to work with. Tom Taft, the infectious diseases physician who thought to look. Joan Rose, who understood water and Cryptosporidium. And I just can't say it enough. You know, we had 3 weeks of craziness at the Milwaukee Health Department and the Water Department. And nobody complained about it. Nobody said, I'm not doing it. Nobody said, I'm not coming in. People showed up for work and did it. And they did it well, they did it hard. And we have a lot of thanks goes to the staff of the Milwaukee Health Department. Okay, that's it. I mean, you can tell from the Cliff Notes version, there's just so much here. There's so many ways to go with it and so many pieces to it. And I've given short shrift to much of it, but I hope people get a sense of it. I know some of you lived through it. In fact, probably everybody here lived through it, except for Jesse, who wasn't born yet. But it was a tough time, and it's kind of strange for me to think that it was 25 years ago. Are there any questions? Anything I can answer? Anybody? George?
Question about that. where does the Howard Avenue plant, where are the areas, obviously the south side, where does it cut off, and the Linwood plant cut in? And also, once you kind of figured out that it was the Howard Avenue plant that was at fault, there was still a boil order for the whole area, right? Who was ever getting Milwaukee water. I'm wondering, I don't know, my memory may not be very good on this, but I guess I was unaware that I knew there was more of a problem down south, and that Howard Avenue didn't think it was immune from the Linwood plant, but it sounds like it all came from Howard.
Well, the contamination, the water, the crib, which was eventually moved much further out into the lake, but that mass that came by the crib came by that intake crib at Howard. But because, there's cross-pollination in this town, we really had to have a boil advisory citywide. We really didn't want to have, the south side has to boil water, the north side doesn't, but they go down and they drink here and they drink there and they work here. And, there's also personal contamination, as there always is. So it just had to be citywide. The plants, and I don't have the exact line anymore, George, but Linwood came all the way down to downtown. So people that work downtown were on the Linwood line. People that worked kind of on the other side of St. Paul was where the Howard plant was. Now, fortunately, when we closed Howard, we had enough strength in our system for Linwood to deliver water. So even when the boil advisory was lifted, the plant was still closed until all the disinfection and all the upgrade. Linwood was able to provide water to both sides of town, and eventually it was brought back online. What am I missing?
Remember the day that happened? We had to put out this meeting, everybody had to flush their toilets and run their faucets for so long to clear out the lines when they lose that. We had a big flush.
The big flush, which is in today's paper if anybody read it. We've done that before. Kathy's point is there are a million things that we had to think about to do this right. And we had enough smart people around where we were able to do it. Just stuff like that. The ice blocks, what it means to businesses. The dental procedures, I never would have thought. Stop the dentist from spraying water in your mouth. Just a million pieces. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but yeah. Anyone else? Yes, Jeannie.
People wondered what the source was, right? And at the time, we didn't have the technology to know which particular species of crypto was a positive agent. Do you have the rest of the story?
It's a $64,000 question, and I'm always asked. I can't really answer definitively. Go ahead.
But I can't.
No, I can,
Okay.
maybe a little too. We've learned subsequently that this parasite's carried it, not just in calves, but in others, including humans. And the big research community has developed a test to be able to identify that this particular oocyst, Cryptosporidium, was in human. How it got in the plant, how it got from humans through the plant, the sewage plant, to the crib, to the intake, we can't answer. So one sec. The other thing I say, when we say, yes, we now know that it was a human origin, we also know there was a confluence of events that maybe if one of these had happened, the whole thing wouldn't have happened. But we had a rough spring, we had raging waters flowing in, we had a rendering company in the valley, and I'm not casting any blame, but just another fact. There was stuff flowing in the rivers, flowing into the lake. We had runoff. We had somebody thought, well, maybe it's in birds, and then you have seagulls all over that part of town. Maybe it's so. We had a convergence of events, and then you had the water treatment plant. The water treatment plant had been working well for 150 years, and there's no excuse for complacency. I get that, But when something's working and you haven't exceeded the threshold, you assume it's working. In retrospect, we know that that plant needed improvement. So you add the plant and the water and the oocysts and all the rest. And is this the one in a century convergence of events? I think it is, even though we know more now than we knew before. Were you going to add something to it?
Well, no, thanks to PCR technology, we couldn't have answered the question at the time.
Right.
But it was, banked specimens, which were the PCR.
What is PCR?
It's a genetic testing to know, to be able to discern not just that you have crypto, but where it came from. So there are like
In
27
origin.
or so different species, and PCR allows you to, it's like a fingerprint. It allows you to find, is it from cows and calves, is it from deer, is it from, because there's all sorts of mice and all sorts of species that have different versions, so to speak, of the crypto.
Yeah, we just didn't have that technology back then. I mean, what we knew was turkeys and cows. Well, we didn't have that many turkeys around, but we have a lot of cows. And, I dared raise it once as a possibility in thinking through, because we really did talk to people about what we were thinking, mention, we have to look at cows, and we have to look at the peck plant in the valley. And the next day, I had 6 lawyers in my office. Honest to God, dressed to the, if you mention the cows or you mention dairy, we're gonna, you're in deep trouble. So it's like we're being speculative. We didn't know what we know now, but it's how science evolves. Let me just go ahead. So,
wasn't there some issue too that they were using a different coagulant in the power plant?
You are right. Again, there's so many pieces to this. There was, and Kathy may have to help me with this, but there was a belief that there was a different coagulant they could use that would leach out certain elements from the water better than the coagulant they were using. And water science, and we had the waterworks folks in there, the American Waterworks, agreed with this switch of coagulants. What did we call them?
Coagulants.
Pardon?
Coagulants.
Coagulants. So they did this, and they did it based on sound recommendation. But because it was at that same time, people wondered, could that have triggered some kind of inability for the water plant itself to work as well as it did under the old coagulant? Most people don't think so, but it's been part of that. I call it the confluence. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. That's one of the things that happened at the same time. Barbara, I'm just gonna, somebody had, I'm sorry.
I was just wondering if you found other parts of the country calling for advice on the water systems, because that's something like that happening,
Yeah, I mentioned New York. I had been involved, every group has a trade organization. There was a national association of city health directors and county health directors and state health directors and waterworks and environmental folks. Everybody has their group. Well, we were on the circuit. Kathy's given this presentation, I've done it. People wanted to learn from what we experienced. So lots of people were talking about it. Lots of people internally, within the country, were talking about it. But we did presentations and met with people from all around the world, because this is not just a phenomenon found here. There is kind of a funny tape. We had visitors, they had an outbreak in Japan, and they came and they interviewed us and they sent us the tape, and we're all overdubbed in Japanese. But it's worldwide. So yes, when I said at the end, I wish it didn't happen here, but it did, and we have advanced the science of this. Many other health departments and many other communities. I could go on with this forever. I would get calls all the time. Most of the calls I would get from commissioners were, oh my God, we think we have an outbreak. How do I deal with the media? And it's like, I think it's the wrong question. But to them, they were scared to death about it. So, there was lots of folks interested. Barbara, I know we gotta wrap up, but go ahead, one more part.
There's now the Great Lakes Water Institute or something, the UWM.
Yeah, Pittsburgh, right?
I'm Pittsburgh, Freshwater, School of Freshwater Sciences. School of Freshwater Sciences, thank you, do it. How does that fit in with crypto? Was that any part of, I mean, Milwaukee is now touted as the best water in the country and the best blah, 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 blah.
They weren't connected at the time. This is a rather newer thing. But we did work with UWM. I mean, as I mentioned, partnerships is everything. We worked with schools, we worked with Madison, we worked with Dr. Rose from out of town. I mean, there were different places where people were now beginning to think about water. And I think a natural evolution of what we learned and what we did led people to believe we understand water. What can we know and teach others about water? And that's, I think, more how the School of Freshwater Sciences came about than directly the outbreak. Paul?
I don't know if you can answer this question, Paul, but I grew up in Milwaukee, a block away from the Howard Avenue water plant. In fact, I remember when it was new and it was open to the community, and I was a young girl and I walked through it, and I remember those beds and the sand, and I had no idea how it worked, but I remembered it. So 1993, the plant would have been probably 25 years old, I'm guessing, and now it's 25 years later. So in 25 years we had this problem. Is there, like with any structure, sort of a not planned obsolescence, but a maintenance program where you know in 25 or 35 years you've got to put a new roof on, you need windows? Is there something like that in health or in water purification plants that might have, again, helped to prevent this problem?
I don't know specifically what their scheduled maintenance plans were, other than I'm sure they had them because they were generating huge amounts of water to feed the city every day. So, and they did have monitors on the beds so they could see the water coming out of this bed and this bed and this bed. And as I said, it worked for so long. When it didn't work, then it was kind of a wake-up call to, well, if this was our scheduled maintenance and this was our scheduled monitoring, let's revisit this. And the beds had been replaced. There were many new monitors, turbidity monitors. The lab testing, water testing that they do is scrutinized differently than they did before. I can't really answer what schedule it was on and did they plan for it to be obsolete. I'm sure there is a life cycle of those beds. I just don't know what they were. I know that when this event occurred, that was the life cycle for those beds. Kathy, do you know more? Did you? Go ahead.
I'm not sure what the maintenance schedule was, but I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, there was a budgetary process for maintenance improvements, but it wasn't enough.
Highly accelerated as a result of this, as you can imagine.
I think the one important part is that we were relying on chlorine chlorination as one of our main primary disinfectant, and the problem is it has no effect on crypto.
No effect on levels that we could live with.
Yeah.
It would eventually kill it, but it would kill us too. Go ahead, Joe.
Just to put in a plug for public health. So if any of you still live in the city, this is something that could happen again, or you're a plane ride away from a measles outbreak or an Ebola outbreak, and the health department is a quarter of the staff that it was when this happened. So talk to your Albert people, and talk to your mayor, and don't forget about public health.
Well, you know, I haven't been shy about talking about this. It's probably got me in more trouble. Even when I was commissioner, I argued that, you know, why do you need more staff? We don't see much need. And when public health is doing its job, you don't see it. I mean, when people aren't getting sick, it's because we're doing our job. When you can go to a restaurant and you don't get sick, it's because we're doing our job. When, you know, we don't have measles outbreaks, it's because we're either immunizing or assuring that others are immunizing their kids. So our invisibility doesn't help build the case for a budget, but we do need to be cognizant of the need to have a health department ready to respond. We had one. I'd like to think we have one today. I think that people ought to ask that question to make sure that we do. All right, well, my voice is given out. Are we good to go?